So for those of you who were with us this morning, welcome back. And for those of you who missed the earlier panel on trauma, you're very welcome. I'd also like to welcome those of us who are joining us online and through Twitter. This morning's panel focused on the general theme of trauma. It discussed what is trauma, what are its impacts on the individual and the collective in post-conflict societies, and it talked through some tools for addressing trauma. We're going to switch gears a little bit for this session, and we're going to look at trauma in a specific country context. And in this case, we're going to look at trauma through the eyes of Libyans and their experiences during the revolution and in the transitional period. I'm really deeply honored to introduce my Libyan colleagues and friends, and as Colette mentioned, Matthew as an honorary Libyan. And you see before you today three outstanding advocates for rule of law and for freedom, both during the revolution and now in the transition. Nejla, coming from civil society and the legal background, the deputy minister, at the time of the revolution, a prosecutor, and Aysem as a psychologist, were among the first to show up at the courthouse in Benghazi to start a protest that sparked a revolution and eventually overthrew Gaddafi's dictatorship. I would also like to honor the other members of our Libyan delegation who've been with us here this week. Mohammed Al-Murjini, who's a senior legal advisor in the Ministry of Justice. Ali Bajigni, who is the Chief of Staff and Press Secretary for the Attorney General's Office. Equally so, they were both a fundamental and incredibly important part of the revolution. And also Adam Al-Rifi, who you don't see because he is very generously interpreting for the Deputy Minister, so he's in the interpretation booth. I urge you to chat to Adam later. He has quite the story to tell about his defection from the Libyan military with his $17 million jet to the US, where he now lives. The sessions will be conducted in English for the most part, and the Deputy Minister will speak in Arabic. You have headsets, and for those English speakers, for the Arabic presentation, you're going to turn to channel 1. If anybody would prefer to listen to the event in Arabic, it's channel 6. I should say, for those who are joining us, the way we've been doing the questions and answers is through note cards. So note cards have been distributed, and I will field the questions at the end of the presentation. Before we begin, I really wanted to single out and mention the Deputy Minister, Najim. Colette and I met him in Libya in January, and Colette and I have been doing this work for quite some time. We have met many ministers in transitional states, but I think we both agree we have never been so impressed as meeting him with his commitment, both personal and professional commitment, to promoting the rule of law and to building freedom for Libya. He's working around the clock, really getting very little sleep, not sleeping, not eating, all to build his country. And as you'll hear when he talks, he's a little bit ill today, but he's carrying on nonetheless. I joked with him that when we were in Libya, that if there was an Oscars for the rule of law, that he would be the winner of this year's Oscar, that he really is a champion for the rule of law, and we are so deeply honored to have him today with us. So this session will be conducted by way of presentations. We're going to look at trauma, as I mentioned, through the eyes of Libyans and those working in Libya. First up, we will have Nejla El-Mangush, who will speak to us as a civil society activist, as a person who was part of the revolution, and as a woman and mother who's been through the revolution and in the transition. Deputy Minister Najim will speak to us from the perspective of the Ministry of Justice in their incredible efforts to build a rule of law in the transition. I think Colette mentioned that it was a conversation with him in January in Libya that sort of sparked pushed us forward to do this event where he discussed how the issues of trauma were impacting his efforts to build a rule of law. We'll also hear about trauma in Libya from Aysem Geriani, who's a psychologist and head of the mental health cluster in Benghazi, and our honorary Libyan Matthew, who has been working in partnership with Aysem, will talk to us about his research from in Libya and his findings from working in Libya and in refugee camps. We're going to kick off this session by looking at a short video. And in this video shows us, through the eyes of revolutionaries, their struggle to get back to normal life after fighting in the revolution. And as you'll see, many of these people had never fought before. I wanted to warn you that in the first minute or two, there's some graphic content. So if anybody's not comfortable with that, shut your eyes. It's around a 7-minute video, after which we'll begin the presentations. Thank you.
If you fight with somebody, you will be nervous. Killing people, and the others kills your friends, and you see the bloods and the dead body, and all this month you were far away from your family. Even with your air, and every day you're hearing bombing, that, I think it will reflect bad things in yourself. I know myself, I'm sick. Wallahi, really sick.
Like thousands of Libyan civilians, Libyan became a soldier overnight. He was a postal worker at the outset of the revolution in February.
If I didn't do this, I will die, and the Gaddafi forces will come into the city and kill many people, and I have to defend my city. And I think it was a necessity to do this. I can't just watch.
Others were students, fishermen, IT professionals, accountants, truck drivers, and almost none of the fighters had held a weapon before facing Muammar Gaddafi's national army on the Libyan front line. Mohammed al-Horshi was a mechanic, but he is now an expert in both light arms and heavy artillery.
كلهم يعرفوا من هو ما يعرفش تو حتى العيل الصغير يفك لك خلاش يركبه 9 ملي يفك ويركب شو تقول؟
Rebel fighters say the transition was tough but necessary. Ahmed al-Said, a computer programmer and father of 4, became a prominent fighter on the Libyan front. He said when Gaddafi's troops invaded Misrata, they were left with no choice.
لما صار القتل اضطرينا للدفاع عن نفسنا وسلاح ما عندناش. كل واحد حاول بشكل من الاشكال وبالطريقه اللي تحصل عليها. حتى من ضمن المواقف لما اول ما ضربونا بالرشاشات ال 14 ونص نشوفوا في الاضاءه في السماء كنا خايفين مش عارفين شنو الحاجات هذه يعني وفي النهايه بكره طلع 14 ونص يعني.
With no weapons, al-Said says some men designed homemade guns. Others made bombs from whatever explosive materials they could find. Although he had no army training, al-Said began designing new weapons from salvaged ammunition, toys, and broken machinery. As the fighting escalated, the rebels were able to retrieve weapons from the enemy, but it wasn't easy.
It was about 50 soldiers from Gaddafi forces, and we jumped inside, and then we catch some of the soldiers, and some of them run away, and we took some guns, and then we started to fight. It was not normal for us, you know. It's the first time we used the guns.
In their adjustment from civilian to soldier, some found their own ways of coping. Marwan Marjorie, who worked for the customs office before the revolution, said listening to love songs and Justin Bieber while firing his 14.5 anti-aircraft gun at Gaddafi troops relaxed him. And love songs?
He said,
But now they are trying to adjust back to civilian life. Ahmed al-Said is in the process of reconstructing his shop and office that were destroyed in the fighting, but without equipment or customers that can afford to spend.
صعب جدا انك ترجع لحياة الطبيعية نفسيا، لأن لما تجي تشوف لو تتذكر أي صديق تلقاه مات. أغلب أصدقائنا ماتوا. اللي ما ماتش مصاب. يعني 75% من أصدقائنا وشبابنا حاليا مصابين. يعني
Mohammed Rujbani was a student and worked part-time for a pro-Gaddafi television network. He began fighting in his hometown in the Nafusa Mountains and continued fighting through to Sirte in search of his 14-year-old brother who was captured by Gaddafi troops. His brother remains missing. He stayed in the militia until he found a job in the Ministry of Defense in Tripoli.
The fighting is over. It's really different when you think about it, and it's really happening now. It's really done. It's all finished.
Libya's economy is struggling, and high rates of unemployment are one reason many of the regional militias haven't disbanded. With so many armed groups, outbreaks of violence remain almost a daily occurrence. The future of Libya is uncertain, and many of those who fought cling to the brotherhood they forged on the front lines.
He said they're like his brothers, and he doesn't want anyone to get near them or hurt them, and he feel like they're brothers, and yeah.
Mohammed al-Horshi has returned to work, but he stays with his unit in Misrata, which is sometimes called on to resolve disputes within the city. Until now, gunshots and explosions can still be heard at night, as regional militias fight each other for power and attack suspected Gaddafi loyalists.
Actually, I don't like to fight anymore. I hate the blood. I hate to kill somebody. You know, even in the war, when I was fighting, sometimes I saw my enemy, but I can't shoot him. If I said if he can run, I will leave him run. But some robbers, they want to carry on. And now, to get back to normal life, for me I'm struggling. I was struggling when I was fight, and now struggling to get back to normal life. Inshallah, we will win in the normal life as we win in the fight.
But that struggle threatens to take even longer than the fight to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. On location in Libya, this is Tracy Shelton for Global Post.
And I'd now like to turn over to Najah Al-Mangush for her presentation.
Good morning. First, I would like to thank Colette and Vivian to give me this opportunity to share with you my small experience in the ground. And thank you to Audrey and everybody support this events. And thank you also to sharing this, emotional video, which really showing the reality in the ground and the truth about the trauma in Libya. I would like to speak about the post-conflict trauma and specifically in Libya. Libya have suffered oppression for 42 years under the Gaddafi regime. The conditioned behavior from this are difficult to overcome in a short period of time. Behavior such as fear, negativity, being closer to others, not being loyal, or replacing a vile of work. People had justifiable reason for this behavior. Those who worked were equal to those who didn't. Those who had degree were like those who didn't. And those who have expressed themselves freely were sent to the jail. Those who try to make their dream come true, even it was by doing a small trade to enhance their living condition, the money would be taken from them. The education, the health, the justice were weakened by corruption. And the Libyan citizen lived in a rich country with a small population, but was deprived of his right that other citizens in other countries have. Try to imagine with me the living condition and the psychological and the social situation in Libya for those years, and then of sudden the revolution happened, to promoted by all of this factor mentioned above. Because of the revolution, Libyan citizens became free and able to express themselves without any fear, able to feel the breeze of freedom and breathe it for the first time after all these years. But freedom cost us a lot. It cost us the precious souls of our militaries from all around Libya. They sacrificed their lives for others to live in the freedom. And for a person to become free after years of oppression, this is a shock itself and dramatic change that needs value, morals, and law to govern it so that it does not turn into a chaos and situation where people are violating others' rights in the name of freedom, which happened quite often after the revolution. Many violence were made in the name of freedom and democracy, and I personally do not blame them, because I believe that is normal, especially for those who are weak and were suppressed for a long time to get confused as the balance of the power has changed. Many hero stories placed during the revolution. One of them is the story of the brave military Al-Mahdi Zio, who died in Benghazi and played a major role in the fall of the bridge Fadil Bouamar in 20 February in 2011. The simple employee was a father for 3 daughters who were the most important thing in his life. His daughters did not imagine that their father would leave them for a much greater love, to love of his country. This man was touched by what he saw, which was one young man trying to enter the military barracks who were shot and killed one after another because they did not have the weapons. The door to the barracks was closed, but Al-Mahdi Zio was brave and courage. He couldn't just watch. He decided to open the door no matter what. He thought a lot and then came up with the idea. He put a gas cylinder in his car and drove his car into the barracks door while reading verses of Quran to give him strength and power. He left his daughter to save the young man, to save Benghazi. They may be lonely now, but they are definitely proud of their father, the brave man who sacrificed his life for his country. In addition to many fighters who lost their lives and while freeing Libya, many of them lost their limbs and now need artificial limbs. I cannot forget the 17-year-old boy from Misrata with the most beautiful smile ever. I met him in the airport. He was very handsome, but he's standing in 2 sticks as he lost both legs during the unfair war. People on the front line were entrained, as we saw in the video, civilians who had no experience in using weapons. They were students, lawyers, doctors, employees, and retired too. They all did 1 week training just to know the basics and then joined to the front line. Each one has his own life and responsibilities, but they put the situation above everything else. Women had a great role in the revolution, play as well as they pushed their sons and husbands to go and fight for freedom. They used to cook for the fighters and support them in many ways. It was a people revolution, people who had no other choice but to fight and participate in this revolution, as it was the hope that brought life into them. Another date that I will not forget, because it had impact in the citizens of Benghazi, especially in some neighborhoods, in the 19th of March 2011, when Gaddafi forces entered the city at dawn from the western entrance. The first neighborhood they entered was my neighborhood immediately after Benghazi University. It was a day I could not forget. The sounds of explosion, and the ground was going to explode because of the heavy tanks. My family and I were sitting at home, surrender. We decided to leave to Allah to save us. We prayed for him to help us and protect us. We did not leave our houses as we decided not to do from the beginning. Many families panicked and got scared to the left and the city, and I cannot blame them. They were not scared of the death, but mostly of rape, and church was new about what they were going to do for the people in Benghazi. At that time, I was a member of the media committee, and I had to be out, but Gaddafi forces were still in the area. So I called my friends to know what was happening, and all the international reports left the city when they know the forces were coming in. The only media crew that was present at that time was Al Jazeera International. My brave colleague, Mohammed Nabous, who was the first to fix a satellite dish in the roof of the court, since we don't have internet or connection at the rest of the world, he went out searching for the reports, but he found empty hotels, so he decided to go in his own and record the horrifying crimes that Gaddafi forces were committing. Then he went to the plane crash since the Libyan plane that was flown by brave men from Benghazi to prevent Gaddafi's forces from entering the city. This helped ease the operation and the fighters' movement in the ground. But the plane was hit, and Muhammad went to document that. He was killed by a sniper shot. We couldn't believe when we heard the news, but it was true. The brave hero left us, but he will never leave our memories. And of course, we cannot forget the NATO and did an order to save the people of Benghazi just at the right time. Their intervention was quick, and we will always be grateful for them, especially in Benghazi. Libya now is going through a new phase, and we have a new improvement. We have temporary government and National Transitional Council. Local elections are taking place in Benghazi, and this is the first time that we have election after a long time of dictatorship. On the 1st of May, the door were open for those who went to run for the national conference, which is going to be formed in the mid of June, hopefully. And the procedure are successful in spite of all the challenges and all the security issue and the psychological and the social trauma that the people are still suffering of. All of these improvement and change that are happening quickly after living in a dark history full of oppression and injustice. Without a doubt, it is not easy because we are simply living in a transitional phase where everything is new and special. We are struggling to get a safe shore. To do this, we Libyans, before anyone else, need to work hard and cooperate and create a space for deep, fruitful dialogue to overcome the psychological trauma that Libyans have suffered through all those years and the trauma they suffered before and during the revolution. People are suffering now because the high expectation from the wonderful revolution and the reality of what they are expressing now. Their high expectations are not met yet, which is accusing them frustration. How can we repay those who sacrifice their lives, body parts, time, and efforts for us? How can we reintegrate them in the society in a positive way and try to help them get over this suffering? I spoke with a friend of mine who's 22 years old and was in the front line at the beginning of the revolution. He told me that they realized that death was the only way to win this war. I saw my friends die. I get injured in front of me, and I stayed on the front line until Tripoli was liberated. Then I came back to Benghazi. I couldn't sleep because we didn't sleep. We were always alert and scared, and also couldn't stand noise or people talking in a loud voice. I preferred to stay at home alone, as I hated the crowd. I had to keep myself busy, and thanks to Allah, to my studies starting again, and I found a place to release the energy and the emotion I had in me. But still there is fear for those who come back to civil life with all the weapons and have no schools or no jobs to go back to. The trauma after the revolution should be looked into deeply, and this needs national and international efforts. We need to recognize the problem and its dimension, and this needs cooperation between civil society organizations, the people, the government, and all the educated people and the political activists to reach out their helping hand and create a space for dialogue, which will help them understand the reality of how they feel and how they can invest those feelings in the right way. With the assistance of international expertise and specialists in this field who have worked in countries which suffered of post-conflict trauma and them trying to adapt them into the Libyan context, and this is one of the branch which the USIP is interested in. Finally, I do not claim to be expert or physical or assistant in this field, but I have been talking about what I experienced during the revolution through my work in civil society organization, both national and international, and as a mother, as a single mother, and as a woman, as a Libyan woman. I would like to share this experience with you, and thank you for attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nejda, for sharing so honestly and candidly with us. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Deputy Minister Wahel Najim, who will speak about his efforts to build the rule of law in the transition. He will talk through some of the great achievements to date and some of the challenges and how trauma is impacting his work. Thank you very much, Deputy Minister.
السيدات والسادة السلام عليكم. إنه لشرف عظيم لبلادي أن أقف أمام جمعكم الكريم في معهد السلام الأمريكي، وقد تحررت بلادي بالكامل واستعادت عافيتها السياسية بعد أن تم اختطافها في انقلاب عسكري مشؤوم منذ 42 سنة من الحكم الدكتاتوري الهمجي القمعي الذي نكل وقتل الرجال والنساء واغتصب النساء وأهدر الدماء وسرق الأموال وحاول أن يقتل فيهم الطموحات وروح الانتماء. وكما تعلمون أن الشعب الليبي خرج في العام الماضي إلى الشوارع في احتجاجات سلمية مطالبا بحقوقه الإنسانية التي كفلتها له الشرائع السماوية ثم الصكوك الدولية، ولكن الرد كان قاسيا بل وحشيا من نظام الجور والعسف الذي أمر كتائب الموت التابعة له بقتل المتظاهرين العزل دون رحمة أو شفقة من خلال فوهات البنادق ومدافع الدبابات والقصف بالطيران. لقد ترك لنا النظام المنهار خليطا من النظم البيروقراطية المعقدة والفوضى العارمة في كل مرافق الدولة، وتركت لنا الحرب عشرات الآلاف من الشهداء والمفقودين وعشرات الآلاف من الجرحى، وتدمير المدارس ومقار المحاكم والشرطة وتخريب المباني الإدارية. ولأجل خلط الأوراق أقدم النظام الهالك على تسريح عدد 17,000 سجين، سلح بعضهم ليكونوا خطرا على الأمن والاستقرار، لأن إلى جانب ذلك هناك عدد من أزلامه المتورطين في قتل الليبيين قد فروا للخارج ولديهم الأموال المسروقة يقومون بأعمال تخريبية تهدد أمن البلاد واستقراره. وحديثنا اليوم عن الصدمة النفسية وتأثيرها على سيادة القانون والعدالة والأمن في ليبيا، وما الذي يجب القيام به للتصدي لها. إن الصدمة عادة تستعمل للإشارة إلى الأحداث السلبية في الحياة، ومن أمثلتها الحروب والعلاج الأمني الشرس الذي تقوم به بعض الحكومات القمعية في مواجهة التظاهر السلمي الذي يستهدف المدنيين أطفالا ونساء ورجالا مسنين وشبابا. والذي يستعمل عادة بشكل منهجي منتظم. ولا شك أن ضحايا الصدمات النفسية يتعرضون إلى ردود فعل تعرف بالإجهاد النفسي عقب الصدمات، فقد يشعر المصاب بالصدمة النفسية بتكرر أفكار وذكريات وخيالات ذهنية تابعة للصدمة التي مر بها، فيشعر كأن الحدث يحدث الآن من جديد، وقد تكون هذه الأفكار في شكل كوابيس مزعجة أثناء النوم. طبعا هذا الكلام توصلنا إليه، لسنا متخصصين في مجال علم النفس، ولكن توصلنا إليه من خلال المنطق السليم. فعادة رجال القانون ما يكونوا منطقيين بحكم أن القانون عادة أو يجب أن يكون منطقي. أحيانا أخرى يشعر المصدوم بضعف ثقته بالناس، وأن هناك حاجز كبير بينه وبين الناس الآخرين، أي وكأنه منفصل عن العالم. وفي ليبيا بالذات نجد أن الانتهاكات التي حدثت من قبل الثوار ناتجة عن صدمات نفسية تعرضوا لها من تعذيب وحبس واغتصاب ومناظر شنيعة شاهدوها وفقدهم لأصدقائهم وأهلهم. ولكن للبحث عن أساليب مقاومة تلك الصدمات النفسية وحسب رأينا ينبغي القيام بتأهيل من تعرض للصدمة في النزاع المسلح حتى يشعر بالثقة في نفسه، وإدماج المصابين بإحدى المؤسسات الدولة والتعرف على مشكلاتهم وإيجاد الحلول المناسبة في أقرب وقت، وإشعاره بأن ما قام به أوصله إلى النتيجة المرجوة، وهذا هو دور الحكومة. إلا أن المؤسسات الحكومية لا يمكنها القيام بدورها وحدها، بل هناك مؤسسات المجتمع المدني، فيجب التعاون بين هذه المؤسسات والحكومة للخروج بالمصاب من تأثير الصدمة. وفي هذا الإطار وضعت الحكومة الليبية الانتقالية خطة مفصلة لإدماج الثوار والذين قد تعرضوا للصدمات النفسية، خاصة وأنهم خارجون من الحرب، وذلك بدمجهم بوزارتي الدفاع والداخلية وتدريب بعضهم في الخارج ومقاضاة من سبب لهم الصدمة النفسية بتقديمه للعدالة وتعويض المصاب، وذلك بالعمل بقانون العدالة الانتقالية والمصالحة الوطنية. وللخروج من آثار الصدمة النفسية يتطلب الأمر احترام سيادة القانون بتقديم مسببي الصدمة للعدالة وتعويض الضحايا، ومن ثم الدخول في مشروع المصالحة الوطنية. يجب أن يعلم الجميع أن العدالة الانتقالية يجب أن تكون من مقدمات المصالحة الوطنية، فلا يعقل أن تكون هناك مصالحة ما لم يعرف أين هو الحق المعتدى عليه ومن المعتدي ومن المعتدى عليه. كل ذلك المرجو منه إعادة الاستقرار والتوازن للمجتمع الليبي وبناء ليبيا جديدة، وندرك بأن ذلك لن يتحقق إلا بجلب الجنات الذين ارتكبوا جرائم القتل والاغتصاب إلى العدالة، بتوفير محاكمة عادلة وجبر الضرر بتعويض الضحايا، وفتح قنوات بين الجميع لتجاوز مآسي الماضي ولإخماد نار الفتنة التي خلفتها الحرب وسنين الظلم. ومن ثم يمكننا القول بأن الانتهاكات المرتكبة من قبل الثوار وهي فردية ليست ممنهجة بوازع الانتقام جراء ما لقيه المصاب من وقائع شاهدها بنفسه تعد أثر من الآثار النفسية المترتبة عن الصدمة. وحرصا منا على مقاومة الصدمة النفسية في بلادنا التي تأثرت بالصراعات بهدف السعي إلى تحقيق قدر أكبر من الأمن والعدالة وسيادة القانون، أصدر مجلسنا الوطني الانتقالي قانون المرحلة، وهو قانون العدالة الانتقالية والمصالحة الوطنية. وقامت الحكومة بالإعداد والتجهيز لمقار المحاكم والنيابات والشرطة لتوفير المحاكمة العادلة لمن انتهك حقوق الضحايا. ولذلك ولعدم سعة الوقت لتناول جميع أطراف الموضوع، محل النقاش والدراسة المطروح في هذا اللقاء المثري، نرى أن هناك بعض الأعمال المساعدة للخروج من الصدمة النفسية يجب القيام بها، وأخرى يجب تجنبها. وأعيد هنا أنني لست متخصص في مجال علم النفس، وإنما هذا بالقراءة المنطقية للأحداث وبمعايشتنا للأحداث فعلا في مدينة بنغازي خاصة وفيما بعد في مدن الأخرى. ومن الأعمال التي يجب القيام بها والتي لن تكون شاملة إلا أننا نوجزها، منها ما توصلنا إليه بالبحث والدراسة والمعايشة كما ذكرت، ومعايشة الحدث بكل تواضع وبساطة. أولا، نرى أن يحافظ المصاب على روتين حياته اليومية مما يشعره بأن الحياة تسير بطبيعتها المعتادة، وأن كل شيء تحت سيطرته مما يعطيه الشعور بالأمان والسلامة. ثانيا، تلقي الدعم والتشجيع ممن حوله مما يخفف عنه الآثار السلبية للصدمات. ثالثا، التصرف الحكيم مع المشكلات الحياتية بحيث لا تتراكم وتتضاعف لتزيد من شعوره بالنتائج السلبية للصدمة الأولى الأساسية. مصداقا لقول أحد المتخصصين في عدالة انتقالية، موجودة سيدة كانت هنا قبلنا، نعم، ذكرت أن سياسة الحكومة كثيرا ما بعد هذه النزاعات المسلحة أو الحكومة الجديدة بعد النزاعات المسلحة، سياستها يجب أن تراعي هؤلاء الناس الذين تعرضوا للصدمة في كل شيء، حتى في اتخاذهم للقرار، حتى في إصدارهم للقوانين، حتى في تصريحاتهم على التلفاز. التأكيد على القيام ببعض الأنشطة المسلية. يجب أن يقوم المصدوم ببعض الأنشطة المسلية لما لها من أثر كبير على الصحة النفسية لضحايا الصدمات، وبعدها أن يرفق المصاب بنفسه أو يعني يحاول أن يرفق بنفسه ولا يشعر بضعف الثقة في نفسه. ذلك يقلل فعلا من قدرته في التكيف مع الصدمة. يجب أن نبعث في نفسه ثقة لكي يستطيع فعلا أن يتكيف مع هذه الصدمة. أن يحاول مواجهة المواقف والأشخاص والأماكن التي ترتبط في ذهنه بالحدث الذي تعرض له. أن يتذكر بأنه لا بد للإنسان أن يتحمل بعض المخاطر التي قد تأتي بها الحياة. يجب أن يعي ذلك. أما الأعمال التي يفيد فعلا تجنبها، وهي أولا محاولة تجنب المصاب مشاهدة الأحداث التي تكون بأسلوب انفعالي ومثير للعواطف والتي تهدف إلى صدم المشاهد. يعني مشاهدة الأخبار المزعجة التي فيها مناظر شنيعة بالنسبة للمصدوم بالتأكيد أمر يقلب عليه المواجع كما يقال. ثانيا ألا يحاول كبت أفكاره، بل يجب التعبير عنها، وألا يحاول المبالغة في طبيعة الصدمة. ألا نتركه يبالغ في طبيعة الصدمة، أن نتركه يعبر عنها كما يريد. لا نتركه يستنتج نتائج غاية سلبية، نحن نساعده في استنتاج كل شيء. ألا يلوم نفسه على المشاعر التي قد يشعر بها بسبب هذه الصدمة. ألا يلوم ذاته، لأن ذلك سيزيد من المعاناة. السيدات والسادة، نؤكد من هذا المنبر مجددا أن بلادنا قادرة على تجاوز مآسي الماضي وإخماد الفتن ومعالجة الضحايا وتعويضهم، وأننا سنعمل على احترام سيادة القانون. ولكن هنا، ومن خلال ما أثرونا به السادة السيدات الذين كانوا قبلنا هنا، وليس هذا الكلام ليس مكتوب، وأضعه في تساؤلات، وهي تتعلق ببلادي كونها لا الأولوية الأولى لدي. أن سياسة الحكومة في استيعاب الثوار بعد عودتهم من الحرب وإدماجهم في وزارة الدفاع، هل ذلك من مصلحتهم؟ بعد استقراء كل هذه التحليل النفسي الذي تقدموا به الأخوات والإخوة، فإذا كنا نحن نريد إبعاده عن الفكرة العسكرية وعن المظاهر العسكرية المخيفة، فكيف لنا نضعه في مؤسسة عسكرية ونسلم له سلاح؟ وأنتم تعلمون كثيرا ما حصل، أن يقوم العائدون من الحروب بردود فعل مع الناس قد تصل إلى حد القتل وإزهاق الأرواح. هناك نقطة أخرى وهي لاحظناها على ثوارنا بعد عودتهم من الحرب بفترة، وهي أنهم يشعرون بقلة الشأن بعد أن كان شأنهم كبير. الجميع يغني لهم، الجميع يشيد بهم، وفي فترة وفجأة يشعرون أنفسهم أنهم لا شيء ولا ينظر إليهم أحد. بالتأكيد هذه فعلا تكون صدمة نفسية فعلا، وسيكون لها رد فعل، وفعلا حصلت بعض الظواهر وإن كانت قليلة جدا، وبالتأكيد الجميع سمع وهذا عرض في الإعلام. ونحن الآن دولة منفتحة على العالم، ولا نريد أن نكون كالنظام السابق نخفي بعض المسائل التي يعتقد البعض أنها تخلخل ثقة العالم بنا. لا، بل بالعكس، نحن يجب أن نعرض لكل العالم مشاكلنا لكي يستطيع أن يساعدنا. لاحظنا فعلا أن الثوار قد في بعض الأحيان يتهجمون على مؤسسة حكومية أو ما شابه ذلك. نحن يجب أن نتساءل ما الذي وصل بهم إلى هذا، ولا نتساءل لماذا فعلوا ذلك، عن الأسباب أو الدوافع. وما دورنا نحن الحكومة إلا أن نعالج هذه المشاكل. فلهذا أخوتي هناك الكثير من التساؤلات، وفعلا هذه النقطة مهمة، وهي أن سياسة الحكومة فعلا إن كانت سليمة وتراعي الحالة النفسية التي عادوا بها هؤلاء المحاربين، يجب يعني أن يكون القرار مناسب لمشاعرهم، لا يستفزهم، بالإضافة إلى عدم التكلم بصيغة سأفعل سأفعل سأفعل. نحاول دائما أن نقول عما فعلنا فعلا، لأن خاصة لدى الشعب الليبي 42 سنة من الوعود الكاذبة، يكفيه من ذلك. وهناك تساؤل آخر لكم أنتم أيها الخبراء في هذا المجال، وهو كذلك السيد عصام طبعا متخصص في مجال علم النفس. هل يجب أن نفرق بين المدني الذي اضطر إلى حمل السلاح وشارك في الحرب في مسألة الصدمة النفسية، وبين من كان مجهز مسبقا ليكون محاربا؟ وهل يمكن أن نقوم في المجال العسكري أو في المؤسسات العسكرية بتأهيل العسكريين نفسيا بعرض مشاهد الحروب وفظاعتها عليهم قبل اشتراكهم في المعارك؟ يجب هنا التفرقة بين المدني الذي اضطر إلى حمل السلاح وما ردة فعله والصدمة النفسية وردة فعل عن الصدمة النفسية، وبين العسكري الذي اعتاد حمل السلاح وليس جديدا عليه ما يراه في الحروب وهذه النزاعات. وفي الختام هنا، وأرجو أن لا أكون قد أطلت عليكم، في الختام لا يسعني إلا أن أتقدم بوافر الشكر والتقدير إلى السادة بمعهد السلام الأمريكي لتنظيم هذه الندوة، وأننا إذ شاهدنا من خلال جولتنا بالمعهد من اهتمام ببلادنا التي ستكون دولة القانون التي لطالما حلمنا بها، فإننا نتمنى لهذا المعهد تحقيق النجاح الذي يصبو إليه. وشكرا لحسن الإصغاء، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister, for conveying to us some of the challenges you face and the efforts that are being made to address trauma. I'll now hand over to Issam Gariani, who is, as the Deputy Minister mentioned, a psychologist and head of the mental health cluster in Benghazi. Thank you, Issam.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know how I was tricked into this, but I thought I was the fourth, not the third. But it's okay. It's okay. I wouldn't have much to say after Dr. Matthew, a leading figure in the issue of trauma. Anyway, first and foremost, please allow me to thank you for having me here with you, and to express my gratitude and appreciation to the USIP for all the effort they are exerting to aid the new Libyan government, its people, during this transitional stage in the history of Libya. As everybody came to realize, the situation in Libya differs immensely from the situation in the other two neighboring countries, Egypt and Tunis, that had their revolutions as well. After their revolutions, in either case, when the regime was disposed of, it left behind a state with most of its institutions intact and in need of reform. That was definitely not the case in Libya. For over the 40 years of his reign, Gaddafi had succeeded in the creation of let me not say a country, but a human congregation where all powers were consolidated in his hands, and thus a totalitarian state like no other in the history of humanity. His totalitarianism was so comprehensive that it affected every aspect of the people's lives: psychological, social, economic, political, and whatever else you can think of. He succeeded in reducing Libya to a private domain where he dictated all policies of the different sectors, which gradually led to the creation of a state without any institutions. And thus, after his fall, the Libyan people were left with the task of having to build a whole new country, for there was hardly anything to build on. The situation in Libya also differed, for the Libyan revolution had actually turned into a war that resulted in tens of thousands of casualties, missing and disabled. A war that left a deeply traumatized population that is striving to lay the foundations for a new democratic state that respects the dignity of the human being, guided by the principles of human rights and guarded by a democratic constitution. The world looks at the Libyan population as one that had witnessed a crisis over the past year because of the war, while it actually is a population that had been living for more than 40 years a prolonged crisis that had negatively influenced people's attitudes towards education, law, authority, ethics, the concept of time, and life in general. As an example, I would like to mention the clear deficit in the decision-making and organizational skills that we are facing in the current stage. And even though some people may attribute to the effects of trauma which greatly impact such skills because of the state of fight or flight that is imposed by the abnormal situation that the people are put in, I personally, in addition to the trauma, would attribute these deficits to the nature of the regime which never allowed such skills to develop, for decisions were an exclusive specialty of the dictator, and organizational skills of planning, setting strategies, specifying implementation mechanisms, and follow-up schedules were never of any value due to the erratic and chaotic nature of the sole decision maker that was in town. With all that said, I will try to give a brief overview of what is going on in Libya and the challenges that we are facing. The urgent need for psychosocial support and treatment, as well as the gap between the urgent needs and the available resources, was realized early in the revolution. For mental health was never a priority of the health sector, as is the case in most countries, I take it. All over Libya, there are only 2 psychiatric wards, one in the eastern part of the country and another in the west, that were greatly neglected and were never developed. The number of psychiatrists in the whole country does not exceed 20, with probably only 25% of them that are actually qualified in the field. As for psychologists, unfortunately, I would have to say that there are no clinical psychologists whatsoever in Libya, and the psychologists that we have available at hand were the graduates of the University of Benghazi. They were not well trained in facing such situations whatsoever. But many of them really, because of their own motivations, had been working at the psychiatric ward for years and thus had compensated partly for the deficient training that they were subjected to. Despite these facts, we had to deal with an emergency with whatever means that were available at the beginning of the revolutions. Parents had started to report and express their concern for their children's psychological well-being. We received reports from them of sleep difficulties, clinging behavior, thumb-sucking, enuresis, and other complaints, and there were so many of them. We also had, at one time in Benghazi, more than 100,000 IDPs that needed to be attended to their basic needs. Basic needs, real basic needs, and psychological as well. With their arrival, reports of sexual violations started to surface, which was a very unexpected and highly sensitive issue in any society. At that point, we felt overwhelmed and realized the extent of our deficits. Fortunately, the world responded, and a number of international NGOs arrived on the scene and started to provide necessary basic training in psychological first aid and gender-based violence and psychosocial support. Among those were the MSF and the IMC, and of course, Acts of Mercy, which is headed by the gentleman sitting next to me, and I would like to extend special thanks for them, working efficiently with very modest means without much hype. This is an advertisement I will invoice you for. And their role was greatly appreciated, for it motivated our psychologists and social workers to continue their modest efforts with more confidence and in their skills than what they had started out with. As we know, that times of crisis can very often bring about change in societal attitudes that may, under normal circumstances, require years and years. And our war for liberation helped in freeing people from the heavy stigma associated with psychological disorders to a certain extent, and thus adults started to come forward and ask for help, and that made our tasks even more difficult, because the gap between our needs and the available means to deal with them had just widened, and we had actually been for months trying to close the gap about that. every time people are freed from, every person freed from this stigma would come forward and complain. And now we have some percentages of people reporting, I would not say disorder, I would not say adjustment disorder or anything like that, but difficulties in coping with everyday life. When finally the task of liberation was completed, the fighters returned home. The injured needed to be attended to, and we tried to install some degree of normalcy back into our society, so we opened up schools, and that also in itself brought about and brought other problems that we had not realized, and that these people all need immediate services, and those services probably are available in a very limited degree. The other thing is our schools started reporting. I mean, now I know many school directors that are almost climbing the wall because of all the manifestation of violent behavior, as well as vandalism, okay, within the schools. So they are in a position where they are not capable of dealing with it, because actually, even though the Libyan universities had graduated a large number of psychologists over the past 30 years, but in schools and in other sectors, okay, of the society, they really never had that effective role. They were never trained properly, and thus now we have to deal with that as well. A question was put on the table, and that, I believe, was the impetus for this convention. That is basically, with having such a traumatized population and the efforts that are being exerted by so many organizations, and especially the USIP, to reinforce the rule of law and these things, one question that popped up to my mind was, how can the rule of law, or is the rule of law actually compatible with a traumatized population? Yes, we would like to see the rule of law, but then again, you need a citizen that would respect the symbol of law in order to adhere to the laws. And is that available? I don't know if it is available. In the meantime, we have to work very, very hard in order to achieve something like that. We have, of course, as everybody knows, that the whole state of Libya, or the non-state of Libya that was under Gaddafi, okay, when it crumbled, security forces were a tool that they used in order to subjugate the people during the revolution and prior to the revolution. And that led to the fact that now on the streets we have no security people. We have no law enforcement symbol on the street that would make people adhere and listen, and conform to the laws that we have or would like to see happening. So what is it that we need? It seems like we need a mountain of procedures in order to be able to get this country back on the right track and install some kind of stability in it, where it becomes a viable state that everybody can live and hopefully achieve their objectives, their life objectives. We have to really ask ourselves, how is the violator of a law is going to be dealt with in the coming period? I mean, am I going to take somebody off the street because he violated some law and throw him in prison? Or should I realize that this person's motives were not criminal, okay, in any way, but this person is expressing a need to receive treatment, and the only way that he knew how to express that need is by maybe violating the law. So our police, our justice system has to realize that. Our police departments and our policemen have to be rehabilitated in order to be able to understand what is the new Libyan that they are dealing with, so they can take into consideration all these things, because I am afraid if somebody that violates the law is thrown into prison, then I am producing a criminal indirectly. So I end up, instead of fixing a human being and reintegrating him back into the society so he would be a productive part and participate in the building of the society, I would be afraid that erroneous practices and not realizing the extent of the trauma would lead to throwing lots of people in jail. That is when our country is capable of enforcing the law, and then these people would be in prison and would acquire all the necessary skills of the criminal world, and that's not what we want. Finally, I would like to thank everybody, and thank you.
Thank you, Issam. Thank you very much for a really fascinating overview. And I really want to commend you. I know of your personal efforts through the revolution and beyond to help people heal their trauma. It's now my pleasure to introduce Matthew Stanford to speak about his work in Libya.
Thank you. And thanks to the Institute for inviting me in. And what I'd like to do is just talk about what it was like as a mental health care provider to go in from the outside, what I found in Libya, and then what our response has been to try to help the Libyan people begin to rebuild their nation. I'm part of Acts of Mercy International, which is a relief and development organization based in Texas, and I'm the director of mental health services for that. We respond to natural disasters or human disasters around the world, tsunami in Sri Lanka, Haiti, things like that. So we first made contact with the Libyan people in April of 2011. The revolution, just to give you a timeline, began on February 17th in Benghazi. April, we had 2 individuals go into the country just to kind of make contact to see if there would be a possibility for us to assist. That was very positive. We made contact with medical school, with university, with several local and even some federal individuals. And so in October, I was part of the initial assessment team that entered the country. And I think what's important to realize is what we found, and it's been mentioned by all of my friends here at the table, the Libyan people were not just traumatized by a revolution that occurred last year. The Libyan people have been traumatized for 42 years. The revolution was just Gaddafi's last and perhaps greatest traumatic experience that he imposed on them. You have a population that has been traumatized for a generation, and they show that. Their children show that, and it's disturbing to see. So we have to think much more broadly than just the actual combat that occurred. So even individuals who literally had nothing to do with the combat and themselves were not in any danger from the combat are traumatized. So I'll speak to that as I go through. So basically you're looking at an entire population that needs to be deemed traumatized, not just that we have to find the traumatized individuals. It's almost, as I mentioned to another colleague, at my times in Libya, I've rarely come across someone that didn't tell me they or one of their relatives was imprisoned for some period of time and tortured. It's almost surreal sometimes. So we went in and made the assessment. I think one of the things that's most interesting about Libya that I haven't seen anywhere else is the Libyan people recognize that they're traumatized. The Libyan people mentioned immediately, within the first hour of us being there, that their number one need was mental health. I have never seen that before. In fact, it's almost impossible to imagine because they have no mental health system. How they recognize that, I'm not really sure. I'll take it as divine influence because they clearly recognize that that's a problem and that's needed. So that began, and that is indeed what we found. So that began a process where we began to respond from a mental health perspective. So we began in Benghazi. At the time we first went in, the revolution was actually still going on. Benghazi was where it began and was one of the first liberated. So we began in the east in Benghazi, and we began to extend from there. In October, when we first went with the assessment team, we established permanent personnel on the ground there, and we've had personnel there since then. What we did, our approach is this: we send in short-term expert teams for approximately 2 weeks at a time. Those rotate continually through, and that way we can bring in experts in mental health or physical therapy or whatever is needed. So no one has to go in. We don't have to find a mental health professional that will go for a year. We can rotate them in at 2-week intervals. I've developed a psychosocial intervention that is led by non-mental health care professionals that we established in the country. And again, one of the things you have to understand is you're looking at 6.5 million people and there are no mental health care providers, basically. So you must work with non-mental health care providers to provide the services. So we have a 10-week psychosocial intervention. It's cognitive behavior therapy based. We send in training teams to train individuals to become trainers and individuals to become facilitators of those programs. They're called healing groups, or in Arabic, shifa groups, because no one likes to go to a psychosocial group, but everybody likes to go to a healing group. And so, and everyone is invited. This is, as I said, you have a population that's heavily traumatized. There's no reason to try to screen people to come in. Everyone is invited, whether they feel like they're traumatized or not, because everyone can benefit. Because as we've heard from some of the other panelists today, if you even have a traumatized individual in your family is going to be traumatized by that. And so it's psychoeducational in that you learn about trauma, but it also teaches you skills to deal with the trauma and move beyond that. I'll speak to that more in a little bit. We have basically three populations that we're dealing with in a very broad sense. You have civilians that were exposed to the combat. That includes obviously both adults and children. As I said before, the population is heavily traumatized. Gaddafi used systematic rape as a weapon. He also imprisonment and torture, execution. So all the people have been touched by that. You have the combatants. The combatants are a very unique group because they were not trained to be soldiers. Which makes them even less resilient to what they had to deal with. We know that even from our own military. If we look at reservists versus full-time military personnel, they show higher rates of post-traumatic stress problems. So you have shopkeepers that suddenly were on the front lines, but they've been extremely open to being involved in the groups. And then finally we have the IDPs. The IDPs are a unique population in their own right because most of them are in some way associated pro-Gaddafi. And particularly the Tawagans, which are ethnically diverse from other Libyans, are held accountable for atrocities in Misrata. So they themselves have had atrocities brought upon them for what probably some of their people were involved in. So they have been separated from the population and are in IDP camps. So that it's a kind of a unique and separate group. So this is what you have before you, and then you have no system to help you try to deal with that. So our approach was to train non-mental health professionals to lead these groups. We began both in the IDP camps and in the university setting, also in a large medical center there. We train individuals and then begin to branch out from Benghazi. Each group is 8 to 10 people. And then over a set of groups would be an individual like Assam, for instance, that would then be there to answer questions or help those move along. It went actually quite well. We sent it grew up very, very quickly. We sent an assessment team from the UK in March to gather the first data from that. And what we find is that the groups are dramatically effective. Huge reductions in post-traumatic symptoms from pre to post. The individuals actually enjoy the groups greatly, which was another thing we were looking for, but they are getting better. The symptoms are alleviating. One of the key aspects of the group is this. This was asked earlier in the first panel, kind of what is kind of the approach, and the idea is this. People don't realize they're traumatized. You have to help them understand that the feelings they're having are because of trauma, that it's not something that they did that they're wrong, they just think their way out of it. Many of them don't realize they were traumatized. I mean, if you were a combatant, you may realize that you saw something, but if you were just someone in a town somewhere, you may not realize that you've been traumatized. And so you help them recognize that they have been traumatized, that the physiological experiences they're having, the cognitive experiences they're having, the behaviors they're displaying are the result of that trauma. Help them understand that that's a collective experience within that group. So really what you're doing is you're building community within each one of these groups. And so each group becomes its own community, and then that connects to other groups, and ultimately you're rebuilding the community 8 to 10 people at a time. So from there you give them tools to deal with those experiences, and then ultimately give them tools to be resilient, and so they can move on. I would say the Libyan people are tremendously resilient, because they may be heavily traumatized now, but they have survived 42 years of trauma. So I'm actually quite excited to work with them. We also have been trying to train the mental health professionals that are there. or those that consider them mental health professionals. As Assam said, many of them or most of them are fairly poorly trained, and we did a 3-day mental health conference, and we're going to be doing some more intensive training throughout the summer to try to help them prepare themselves to deal with those that are going to have long-lasting effects from this. Most people in a population are resilient, although they will all show symptoms, but there is going to be a core group that's going to show long-term symptoms, and we need to prepare them for that. So as our long-term plans are, we have children's play therapy groups that we're beginning now. The translation has taken some time, but it is ready now. We're beginning that. We also have the 6-week intensive that we're going to do out throughout the summer for mental health professionals throughout the country to help prepare them. We're extending those Shifa groups beyond Benghazi. We've been out as far as almost to Misrata on our training. Other NGOs are asking us to train them, and we think that's a good opportunity to spread it further. And then also what we want to do is we are a development organization, so we're trying to, our goal is not to just deal with trauma. Our goal is to help Libyan people develop a mental health care system. And so as we are focusing on trauma now, because really we're about 8 months out from the end of the revolution, I would imagine within a year we would not be dealing with trauma so much as we'd be dealing with more general mental health issues. And so we're trying to show them how to move those trauma groups into more general mental health groups and develop a mental health care system that they can take into the future to help their people. So to put this more in the context of rule of law, I mean, one of the things I would say is this: trauma is extremely isolating. What's happened to the individual when they're traumatized is that their body has decided that this is the response to protect it. So the physiological response is overwhelming. In essence, you're in the fight and flight response and you're trapped in that moment. You can't move beyond it. That doesn't allow you to connect with other people, have relationships. It doesn't allow you to connect with judicial systems and things like that. You simply are trying to survive in the moment. And if you're trapped in that moment and you can't move beyond it, then it makes it very difficult for you to follow the rule of law. And so that's the issue here. Trauma is isolating and it destroys community. And the goal of our Shifa groups are, in a sense, to heal the community, to build community 8 to 10 at a time. I know that sounds not like a lot, but when you're dealing with 6.5 million people, I think the best way to start is to start with individuals and also to equip the Libyan people to do it. One of the other mistakes I've seen NGOs make, and even we've made this in the past, is to come in and think that you're going to find professionals that are going to take over and fix everything. You just can't do that. You have to look to individuals that are willing. That's who you're looking for. And I have found the Libyan people to be tremendously willing. They're very strong, very proud people. I think their future is very bright. I do think they have, strangely enough, the trauma that they've gone through all these years has built them into a people that are rather resilient. And so I think they can work off of that and use that to their advantage. So again, I think, someone asked earlier about putting these systems in place and when you would do that. I think you have to try to put the systems in place as early as you can. I think what you have to do is you have to teach your traumatized people that the systems can be trusted. And I think that's one of the real problems right now in Libya, because if you've lived under a totalitarian dictator for 42 years, I'm not sure that you're going to trust the new policeman that comes down the block next week. So thank you, and just appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. It was wonderful to hear about practical tools on the ground that are working, and thank you for highlighting the awareness and resilience that exists in Libya. I know Colette and I saw that firsthand. So now we have a few questions, and there are 2 questions for the Deputy Minister. So I will speak slowly so that we can have them interpreted correctly. The first question for the Deputy comes from Peggy from the Campaign for Innocent Victims in Conflict. She said, you mentioned compensation programs for those who were harmed during the revolution. Can you talk about the compensation programs and talk about how this is helping to heal Libyan society? So to talk about the compensation programs and how this is helping those who experience trauma. And we have a related question from Salah Bougazia from Libya. and he would like you to talk more about what the NTC is doing to deal with trauma.
طبعا مش عارف السؤال الأول، مش عارف كابتن حازم كان متذكره. السؤال الأول الجزء الأول منه ما سمعتش والله الحلقة. أوكي. طبعا وزارة العدل هي المسؤولة عن تعويض المتضررين بصفة عامة عادة يعني، وجميع اللجان تعويض العبد لله ما عدا أبو سليم هو رئيسها الوزير شخصيا، لكن باقي اللجان العبد لله هو رئيسا يعني. سواء كان يعني حتى أصدرنا قرار بتعويض ضحايا تشاد يعني حرب تشاد، فحتى يعني حتى الضحايا والحقوق اللي في الماضي إن شاء الله حيحوضوا عليه، وبقرارات رسمية صدرت وشكلت لجان بهذا الشأن، وقاعدين نجمعوا في الملفات باش نقدروا التعويض ونقروا. طبعا أنا هتكلم كثيرة لأن عارفين أنتم النظام السابق تعدى على حقوق كثيرة يعني، وأهدر حقوق كثيرة، حتى قانون رقم 4 عارفين أنتم بتاع التخصيص أو الزحف، والزحف كذلك حتى هو، وحتى أصدرنا قرار بتعويض عن 86 الغارة الأمريكية، حتى هو صدر قرار تعويض المتضررين. يعني بالنسبة للتعويضات قاعدة القرارات موجودة، الميزانية مرصودة إن شاء الله تعالى، والبعض بعض القرارات باش يقعدوا عارفين الناس جميعا يعني مش نحن اللي أصدرناها جدد، كانت موجودة سابقا، لكن كانت الهيكل اللي يتابع في تنفيذ القرارات مخابراتي يعني تلقاه مكون من الأمن الداخلي واستخبارات وكذا، لكن توا كلها ناس قانونيين وماليين وفي الشؤون الاجتماعية منطقية شوية تشكيلة قعدت يعني. احنا خطبنا لما جينا خطبنا في هذه اللجان مجلس الوزراء وقلنا لهم التشكيلة هذه ما عادش نقدروا نشتغلوا بها، ولا اللي الأعضاء اللي كانوا يمثلوا فيها حيكونوا موجودين يعني، اللي فر واللي هلك يعني. فالحمد لله مسألة التعويض هذه فعلا درنا فيها خطوات عملية، وإن شاء الله حيستحق كل شخص صاحب حقه يعني في القريب العاجل. بالنسبة للمجلس شنو بيدير بخصوص الصدمة النفسية، هو الحقيقة المجلس في بعض الأحيان بحكم قلة الخبرة حتى نكون واضحين والعالم يشوف في كل شيء يعني ما فيش داعي نخفوا شيء، بحكم قلة الخبرة في بعض طبعا والأزمة وكذا، فهو بروحه مرة بصراحة الحقيقة يعني مش نكونوا واضحين يصدم فينا نفسيا يعني. نكونوا واضحين يعني، خاصة القانون الأخير أنا واحد من الناس اعترضت عليه اللي هو تجريم تبجيل نظامه، هذا لا يمت للديمقراطية ولا أي صلة، ومخالف حتى الإعلان الدستوري يعني، وفي طعن دستوري فيه تو موجودة من المحكمة العليا باش يشوف العالم كله لأن فعلا ليبيا أصبحت ليبيا دولة القانون فعلا. فلهذا يعني المجلس الانتقالي شنو حيدير؟ هو السلطة التشريعية لازم يصدر قوانين تتعلق بهذا الشأن يعني. فالمفروض نفس القرار بتاع المنحة اللي صرفوها للثوار سبتنا مشكلة كبيرة جدا، لأن ما يضعش في خطط، يصدر قرار دون من غير ما يشوف عقبات أو توابع القرار. فعلا هذا يعني جيد جدا ان احنا الحكومة نفسنا ننتقد السلطات التشريعية، هذه حرية فعلا، ورا ديما ننتقد فيهم حتى في حضورهم يعني، هذا مش في ظهرهم ولا حاجة، لكن زي القرار يعني ما عندكش قاعدة بيانات للشعب الليبي وتصدر قرار ان تعطي كل واحد فلوس يعني مش منطقي يعني، حتى هتسهل حتى عملية الفساد المالي انت يعني. فلهذا يعني للأسف شديد ان المجلس احيانا يصدم فينا واحيانا حقيقة يفرح فينا، لكن هذا كله طبعا ان شاء الله يعني هذه البداية يعني، هذه البداية ان شاء الله لازم منا تعثر في البداية باش تقعدوا عارفين راهو مسألة ان تكون سلطة تشريعية وتصدر قوانين راهو مسألة خطيرة جدا وكبيرة جدا. انا ديما حتى نحث فيه ونقول ان احنا في حالة طوارئ، المفروض انه يكون في تكثيف لاصدار القوانين، لكن في نفس الوقت لازم يكونوا المجموعة اللي تصدر فيها القوانين مجموعة متخصصة، لأن صياغة القوانين فن، هذا فن ماهوش علم ينقرأ، هذا فن يجب أن يكتسب بالخبرة في العمل القضائي والعمل القانوني. فلهذا في ضعف فعلا ما ننكرش في المجلس الانتقالي، وأستاذ صلاح أكيد عشان يثير النقطة هذه من ناحية أن المجلس متأخر دائما متباطئ في معالجة بعض الأمور، وهم فعلا أنا ديما ننتقد في الأسلوب العلاجي اللي يستعملوا فيه ومبتعدين عن الأسلوب الوقائي، وانا ديما اتمنى ان يتوقعوا حصول الشيء مش يقعدوا يعالجوا في الشيء، وان يكون عندهم بعد نظر ما ينظروش عند ارجلهم، لأن السلطة التشريعية يجب أن يكون قوانينها تتماشى مع الظروف اللي نحن فيها، وما عادش نبوا قوانين استثنائية وما عادش نبوا محاكم استثنائية، وحتى مسألة سيف ديروا لها محكمة بروحها ومش عارف وسجن بروحها. يعني هل سيف بشر والتانيين مش بشر؟ سجن واحد، يعني هو يقعد في 5 ستار جاكوزي وأحواض سباحة يعني، والآخرين الليبيين يعني حتى الواقعة اللي قايم بها اللي في سجن الكويفية مثلا واقعة شرب خمر، يعني حاجة تتعلق بين الله يعني في النهاية بكل مش واحد، والجرائم اللي ارتكابها نسيف يعني. فلهذا يعني نحن باذن الله ما عادش في شيء استثنائي، حيكون كل شيء كيف العالم متقدم، العالم متطور ان شاء الله. يعني مستبشرين كلنا يعني بالانتخابات القادمه هذينا ان تكون ان شاء الله في حكومه منتخبه تمثل الشعب كما يريد هو ومن يريد هو. وان شاء الله نبشرك سيد صلاح ان حتى المجلس كان ما دار شيء في الجاي ان شاء الله في حلول ان شاء الله باذن الله.
If I may elaborate regarding what has the NTC done regarding the trauma, the thing is this. The thing is the NTC probably is not its specialty to deal with the trauma, except in terms of legislation, things like this. But the temporary government, there are some signs that they are starting to take care of such a problem. There is quite a degree of cooperation with the WHO. And over the past 4 or 5 weeks, they have been meeting and with the Ministry of Health, and they are trying to put together a national strategy, mental health strategy, that should seek to improve the mental health services in the country. That would probably take quite a while, but then again, we have to deal with the short term, and we have to deal also with the long term, and I think that process is already going on. I hope it's not thwarted. Thank
you. We have another question. The person didn't put their name. Nejla and Issam, you mentioned that Libyans have been traumatized for the past 42 years. So where do you begin when all people have known is violence in their lives? Where to begin? Maybe we'll start first.
Okay. Where do you begin? Where do you begin? There is so much at hand that you have to begin somewhere. You have to address the immediate issues that we have as a result of the revolution, of the war itself. And at the same time, we have to start addressing the other issues that were a result of the nature of the regime itself. We have a population that was nurtured on so many erroneous values. For example, promotion, okay, and productivity had nothing to do with each other, okay? So if you produced, if you worked, it does not necessarily mean that you are going to be promoted. What meant that you're going to be promoted is how close are you to the regime. Are you a crony? If you are a crony of the regime, then you are going to be promoted. If you are not, then regardless of how much effort that you exert, it's not going to make a difference. But there are issues as well that have been taken up by so many NGOs, and we hope that there are so many training programs that are being planned for to improve the organizational skills of the Libyan people, technocrats especially, because like I had mentioned in my presentation that, for example, we know that we need a technocrat that is capable of making a decision. Now, we have technocrats that are not capable of making a decision because decision-making was never their responsibility. They always received the decision from up there somewhere, and they just had to implement it. And at times, even the mechanism of implementation was decided for them. So that in itself made them never acquire that skill. Organizational skills, and this is one thing that we suffer, and lots of the foreign bodies that are present in Libya right now are complaining of, and that is basically there is no organization. There is not too many that are capable of sitting down, putting a plan, deciding the strategies, identifying the mechanisms, and putting the follow-up schedules for evaluation, things like this. And this is something that hopefully will be acquired in time through the training and through practice once they realize that the person that used to thwart the acquisition of such skills is not around anymore. And not only the person, the system itself is not around anymore. So this is my opinion of the question.
Nejla, do you want to add, Deputy Minister? So I have another question, also from Nsala Bougazia from Libya. So you have talked about the signs of trauma you're seeing, and he's asking, can you go into a little bit more detail about what signs and indicators of trauma you've been seeing from the people in Libya? What are they telling you, or are there symptoms or manifestations of the trauma?
Yes, I mean, there are signs that we have received, reported by different people, whether in children or adults with the ex-fighters and otherwise. We have, for instance, regarding children, enuresis is a very, very common complaint. Children that went back to bedwetting, and that was something that they had overcome like 4 or 5 or 6 years prior to that. Thumb sucking, the same thing, clinging, not wanting to leave the house, sleep disturbances, nightmares, and difficulty to fall asleep in the first place. And now when it comes to the older age group, and especially the fighters, there is some very, very interesting signs. We had some people that could not sleep in the house, inside the house. That just, I mean, being inside the house would make them feel claustrophobic, and that is something that they have to deal with. Lots of complaints about not being able to concentrate, focus on anything, and carry on with it until it is finished. There is complaints of bursts of rage, flashbacks, reliving the experience. I mean, lots of people we have seen that are complaining of suddenly they feel like they are under the same the circumstances that they lived in the front line. But other things that have been manifested, and only lately, is a criminal activity that was never typical of the Libyan society. And that is basically, yes, during the Gaddafi regime, we've had lots of murders and things like this. But over the past month, we've had a couple grisly crimes that were never really the typical of the Libyan, even the murders. Prior to that was a shooting or a stabbing or something like that. But then for a brother to kill his brother, wife, and children, and then not necessarily really knowing why he did it, that is a problem. For a father that killed his son and cut him in two, that is also something totally new to the Libyan society. So there are so many other signs that are being reported, people being anxious, people are being getting feelings of desire to take revenge against other people, looking at the society as a probable foe in the future, and that they are now not being well received and things like this. All of these are signs that have really, we consider them indicators of people that, of a population that really needs to be taken care of and taken care of urgently right now.
No, we've seen all that. I mean, I actually have a list here of the 6 most common symptoms we've seen in the groups, and those are all listed there. I think one of the biggest problems we're having now is in adolescence with outbursts of anger in the schools, kind of a lack of following authority. We've had a number of school heads report to us, and they really don't have a response to that. But yeah, it's a very difficult thing in that. Kind of trapped physiologically and cognitively in the moment, but then yet they have to live their daily lives. Plus, add to that an enormous amount of unemployment, as was mentioned here. Just because Gaddafi is gone doesn't mean that your daily stressors are gone. There's an enormous number of daily stressors, which just make the situation all that much worse.
Thank you. This is a question for everybody, but I'll ask the Deputy Minister first. You mentioned some of the ways that trauma is affecting efforts to build the law, rule of law. How can you elaborate? Can you give us more details about how the trauma is affecting issues like crime and your ability to run prisons and all of the efforts that you're making in the transition to promote the rule of law?
تقريبا كلمة يقصد لأن ترجمة الأستاذ كابتن حسن طبعا مش قانون ذكر الصدمات تؤثر عليكم بشكل
كيف تأثير الصدمة الشعب الليبي على أداء
لا الشخصي
على دور
يعني.
القانون يعني في دور القانون أمثلة على ذلك يصير مثلا بالصواب.
أوكي. طبعا نحب ننوه نقطة أولا يعني مش كل ما يلتحق بالحرب ويرجع مصدوم نفسيا. نعرف ناس رجعوا من الحرب وعاشوا حياتهم طبيعية جدا يعني هذا أمر ما هوش قاعدة عامة يعني. المسألة هذه ترجع لقوة عزيمة الشخص. في بعض الناس ما يتحملوش يعني ما يتحملش المناظر الشنيعة وفي بعض الناس عادي. مثلا العبد لله كنت يعني نعاين في جثث يعني جبت ناس من خاصة في أحداث كتيبة فضيل في بنغازي جبت ناس في سطولة يعني شخص طوله 1.90 سنتي صرحت بدفنه وسلمت لها طوله 30 سنتي يعني. فبعض الأحيان ممكن لأني بحكم أني كنت يعني وكيل نيابة فمتعود على الطب الشرعي والتشريح والكلام هذا. فيعني مسألة أن العودة من حرب الصدمة النفسية هذه راهو تتفاوت بين الناس يعني بالتأكيد. بالإضافة إلى نقطة هامة جدا وهذه أنا نخاطب فيها جميع حكومات الدول أنها لا تقحم أبنائها في حروب على قضايا ليست حقا. لأن عودة المحارب من الحرب قد يكون مسألة ضمير. هذه صدمة ردة الفعل مسألة تتعلق بضميره خاصة عندما يحارب على قضية مش قضيته وليست حقه. هذه خاطب أنا شخصيا من هذا المنبر جميع الحكومات أنها لا تقحم أبنائها في حروب في حروب بناء على قضايا ليست حقها وليس لهم الحق فيها والاعتداء على حقوق الشعوب الأخرى. فلهذا عندما يعود المحارب من الحرب يعني يشعر بتأنيب الضمير أن خاصة أن بالتأكيد المحارب عندما يقوم خاصة المحارب الميداني يعني يقوم بقتل أشخاص وكذا. فلهذا بالتأكيد عندما يرجع ويعرف أن أو يتذكر أن القضية اللي كان يحارب من أجلها قضية ما هيش على حق بالتأكيد هيتألم وحينصدم نفسيا مهما كان روح إزهاق الروح شيء مش سهل. وبالتأكيد محارب السيد محارب وعارف أنه حتى لو كنت محارب وكنت تدافع عن نفسك وتزهق روح صعب جدا أنك تنسى الموقف هذا يعني. فلهذا يعني حتى وراه في نفس الوقت أنا نأكد أن اللي يكون عليه قضية يعني أو يدافع عن عرضه أو ماله أو روحه ويقتل مش هيأنبى ضميره. أنا متأكد من الشيء هذا لأن الخطر كان محدق به. لكن بالنسبة للسؤال فيما يتعلق ب أو أنا يعني الصدمات تؤثر بشكل يعني جريمة في ليبيا مستوى الجريمة لم يرتفع. ولكن المشكلة وين لو جينا درنا إحصائية بحثوا في السابق أيام اللا نظام كانت نسبة الجرائم أعلى. لكن المشكلة وين أن حجم الجريمة نفسها مش العدد مش الكم الكيف يعني تصاعدت عدد الجنايات. قبل ممكن كانت عدد الجنايات أقل مش كيف الجنح قلت الجنايات كثرت. ليش؟ لأن في سلاح ناري يعني ما يخلف إصابة إما أن تكون عاهة مستديمة وإما أن تزق الروح فإما أن جناية قتل أو جناية إيذاء خطير. فلهذا يعني الجرائم قلت العدد لكن من حيث الكيف تضخمت فعلا. هذا أمر ما نقدرش ننكروه خاصة أن في قنابل وفي كلام هذا والناس كلها متبعة وعارفة الشيء هذا. لكن طبعا الصعوبات اللي مكافحة الجريمة راه في الشوارع طبعا مش اختصاص وزارة العدل وإن كنا نحن من مصلحتنا أن تكافح الجريمة حتى نعرف نعمل يعني أو يخف علينا العمل في الجهاز القضائي يعني سواء في النيابة أو القضاء. لكن وزارة الداخلية هي اللي بصراحة يعني تسأل السؤال هذا عن مسألة ضبط هذه الجرائم في الشوارع وهل هي وفرت الإمكانيات المطلوبة لمعالجة المشاكل هذينا والجرائم التي تقع بالقدر الذي يتناسب مع الوضع الراهن. وأنا في رأيي الشخصي أن الجريمة أثرت علي بشكل كبير من أي ناحية. الاكتظاظ السجون بالمساجين هذا أمر يأثر على وزارة العدل فعلا. وفي تنفيذ الأحكام هذا أمر لأن مختص الشرطة القضائية اللي تابعة لوزارة العدل فلهذا يعني أثر فينا نوعا ما. لكن اللي يسأل السؤال هذا هو وزارة الداخلية. التعامل مع الجرائم في الشوارع من اختصاصها. نحن وزارة العدل هم اللي يجيبونا في المتهم هم اللي يجيبونا في المحضر ونحن نباشروا فيه عملنا. لكن التأثير كان علينا بالسلب من ناحية اكتظاظ السجون خاصة أنه نحن نفتقد حاليا لعدد كافي من السجون وتتناسب معايير دولية لحقوق الإنسان وكذا. في نوع من الآثار السلبية لحقت بالوزارة ولحقت بي شخصيا، تعبت يعني فعلا صح في فترة، لكن وزارة الداخلية يجب أن كلنا ندعمها، لأنه لو اشتغلت وزارة الداخلية كويس، لأن نقول كم حاجة راهو مش منطقي أن واحد يطالب القضاء أنه يعمل والداخلية ما تعملش أو الأمن ما يعملش، مش منطقي بكل يعني، لأن في علاقة تكاملية بين وزارة الداخلية ووزارة العدل لا يمكن الاستغناء عنها. يعني هب أن عضو نيابة جلس في مكتبه في حالة اختلال أمني وكان رجل شجاع وعرض عليه محضر ما وأمر بضبط وإحضار متهم، من الذي سينفذ هذا الأمر؟ هم الشرطة أو رجال الأمن. فلهذا إذا لم تقم الداخلية على قوام أو أساس سليم وتكون إمكانياتها سليمة وتتماشى مع الوضع الراهن، فأنا صدقوني يعني العمل القضائي لن يعمل بشكل متكامل، سيعمل ولكن ليس بشكل متكامل، وستحصل بطلان في الإجراءات، خاصة إذا كان القائم بالقبض ليس مأمور ضبط قضائي وأشياء من هذا القبيل. وهذه هي أيضا من الآثار السلبية. اضطررنا في بعض الأحيان أن نأمر بحفظ بعض القضايا وإن كانت في بعض الأحيان خطيرة، وفي بعض الأحيان أن تحكم القضاء بالبراءة لأن القائم بالقبض هو مأمور ضبط قضائي، وعندنا قاعدة تقول ما بني على باطل فهو باطل، فالإجراء الباطل يلحق كل الإجراءات تكون باطلة. فلهذا فعلا حتى أثر علينا بالسلب من ناحية العمل القضائي سواء في النيابة أو القضاء. إن شاء الله نكون جاوبت يعني بقدر ما اللي يبي صاحب السؤال يعني.
Thank you. And thank you for raising, I think, a key point at the beginning of your presentation, our response to this question, that not everybody suffers from trauma. Some people do and some people don't, so it's not the whole country. I have a question for Matthew and Issam from the Committee of Women Supporting Participation in Decision-Making in Libya, our colleagues over here. They're asking, is there any rehabilitation for rape victims, and how is the government dealing with these very sensitive cases and issue of rape?
I'll go first. In the healing groups, we do have a set of them that are specifically set up for individuals who have been sexually assaulted or raped. And those groups are made up entirely of individuals that were survivors of sexual assault or rape. So they have that collective experience, and then we have supplementary material that goes along with that. So we have special groups set up for those survivors. We have special groups set up for combatants, people that were actually involved. And then the other groups are just for civilians that just experience the trauma as just war. So yes, we are working on that, and that has been quite a problem. We've come across an enormous number of women who not only were raped during the revolution itself, but were raped throughout the years of the Gaddafi regime. So, and that's where we've run in probably to most of our cultural issues, I would say, is with those women, how they're treated by their family, how they're seen by society. So that's been interesting, although I have seen really what are some really tremendous strides by the Libyan people in an attempt to try to move beyond cultural norms and concerns, to really show great compassion towards a lot of those women. So it's been interesting to see, but I think we have tried to respond specifically to that. That was a big problem that was highlighted early on for us.
Well, I'd like to add to Dr. Matthews' point. One thing, there is basically, are the services available? Well, actually, the services are not really available in the way that we would like them to be. Some training has taken place by some NGOs, that was carried out by some NGOs, but the problem is not in the availability of services or not. The problem itself is in encouraging the survivor of such a violation to come forward and seek the help that she really needs. We try to comply by the international guidelines, no investigative methods, and trying to find out who was raped and who was not raped. That unfortunately, the issue of rape itself was abused in the beginning of the revolution by some figures that maybe they had dealt with it in a very non-professional, maybe they had succumbed to their desire to come out on the media and talk for whatever reason. I'd like to assume good intentions, but the results were very negative. So are the services there? I wouldn't say that they are there in an ideal, very effective manner, but they can be provided by the cooperation with the many NGOs that are on the scene there. The biggest problem that we are facing is that as is the issue is sensitive all over the world. I mean, I'm not trying to say that the issue is sensitive in traditional societies or conservative societies, and it's not, because it has nothing to do with society. It is a woman's dilemma. So a woman in America, in Sweden, in Libya, I'm pretty sure would have the same reaction to rape. So our biggest problem now is how to set the infrastructure to provide the necessary services, because a rape survival would need medical and psychological and sociological as well as legal. But it's not our job to go out investigating and trying to find out and identify the victims. All we can do is promote and announce the presence of such services and encourage them to come forward and ask with utmost confidentiality and secrecy as possible.
Thank you. The next question is for Najla, Deputy Minister Najim, and Isam. And it asks, in an ideal world, what would you like to see happen regarding trauma? What would you like the government to do to address trauma? And what, if any, international assistance would you like to address trauma? So maybe we'll start with Najla. What would you like the government to do, and what, if any, international assistance you would welcome?
Actually, it's a very important question, because the trauma, it's very huge topic, and I don't think so we just depend on the government. This kind of issue, we should work as a networking, between the civil society and, the international and the national, and also the government, the people themselves, the activists, the leaders, and the women, because part of this trauma, we don't want to forget the women playing big role in the revolution since it started, and for many, in different ways, and through the media, also on the front line, and they are part from this suffering. We should not forget, we have a lot of women now. They are widow, they are without husband, without son. We have, pain in each house in the city. So we need to make sure we have the tool to go to the, to make sure all those people, cooperate together and try to figure out how they can find the way to deal with the trauma. And I would like to mention a small story. Last week, I went to the massage because I feel so stressed. And I was working for more than 10 months, since the revolution started. And the women, when just starting with my shoulders, the first question was, have you been in trauma before? And I was shocked, because, that means there's a lot of things that happen in my body, and I couldn't recognize what's going on. And, so we, including myself, everybody was part from the revolution. I was mentioned before, this is a revolution for all the Libyan people. So each one of us have, the impact for this trauma. Maybe not that high level, but we have different levels, different pain, different situation, depending on the cities, and also to the people. So I think it's huge efforts, and we need to make sure we start, keep carry on to find the way how we can deal with the trauma.
Thank you, Najla. Deputy Minister?
نحب نقول شيء مهم جدا. الحكومة مش هتقدر في مجتمعنا تعالج المشكلة هذه. كل كمشيرة حلها اجتماعي وليس حلها ما يكونش من جهة مسؤولة في الحكومة، لأن كل كمشيرة. احنا مجتمعنا سماحته في الترابط الاجتماعي اللي فيه، وهذا كان سبب من أسباب نجاح هذه الثورة المباركة. نحن عندنا تكتم كبير جدا. أنا اشتغلت في بداية الثورة من يوم 17 فبراير، الحمد لله وفقنا الله، اشتغلنا وحققنا في كثير من الحالات، وحاولنا أن نحن نلاحقوا أو تتبعوا حالات الاغتصاب لدينا، لكن بحكم طبيعة مجتمعنا للأسف الشديد كانت في صعوبة علينا. لكن في مجموعة كانت على رأسها قاضية بصراحة اشتغلت ودارت عمل كبير، ممكن الأستاذة نجلاء تعرفها، الأستاذة عايدة بعيو، دارت شغل ورصدت بعض الانتهاكات أو كثير من الانتهاكات خاصة في مدينة زوارة وفي بعض المدن الأخرى. لكن أنا نأكد أن الحل صدقوني حيكون اجتماعي، الحل مش الحكومة، لأن مجتمعنا يعني في حالات واجد الأهالي تكتموا عليه، نوع طبيعة مجتمعنا شوية خاصة جدا يعني من هذه الناحية. فلهذا الحل صدقوني حيكون اجتماعي، هو بدأ الحل الاجتماعي. ممكن خاصة الليبيين يعني لاحظوا الفترة اللي فاتت أن الشباب مقبلين على الزواج من يعني النساء هذين اللي تعرضن للاغتصاب، وهذا شيء، هذا هو الحل اللي جميل جدا. يعني ممكن لو في عالم وحتى وفي بلاد واحدة أخرى مش هيوصلوا له. بالعكس الشباب هم اللي يدوروا وين البنت المغتصبة ويعدوا يحاولوا يجبروا الضرر، وهم اللي يتقدموا لزواجها. وحصلت فعلا، وأنا نعرف ناس تزوجوا فعلا وداروا وعزموني حتى في الأفراح بتاعهم يعني. وصدقوني الحل اجتماعي ما هوش حكومي، يعني مش هيكون حل حكومي. صعب لأن البوحة مثل هذه المسائل في مجتمعنا صعب جدا يعني. في جزء
Yeah, excuse me, but regarding what should the government do or what can the government do, we have to look at the status of mental health within the Libyan healthcare system. Libya, just like just about any country in the world, and amongst them is also the United States, that does not allocate more than 7 or 8% of its health budget to mental health. And thus Libya belongs to a region, according to the WHO, that does not allocate even 3%. So the one thing that they can do is basically allocate more money to the sector of mental health. This is number one. They have to start working, like I said earlier, with whichever body that is interested on laying the foundation for a mental health, a national mental health strategy. That would have to be done immediately. The gap that is between the needs and the available resources is so wide, and thus maybe such steps as integrating the mental health services into the primary health care, that would probably help as well, by training some of the general practitioners to provide such service, and some of the nurses to be subjected to psychiatric nursing training. So all of these things would help tackle the problems and the issue of mental health in Libya in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Issam. And a related question for both you and Matthew from Josh Bancroft in the State Department. Can you speak in more detail about the capacity organizational development that would need to take place to address mental health issues in a systematic way? What organizational development would be needed to address mental health in Libya?
Well, that's a big question. Well, I mean, I think it's at every level. Presently, even when we met with university officials, that curriculum for training even undergraduate level psychology is inadequate. So I think it's going to have to begin at the educational level. I think also Libya isn't all that much different than the United States in many ways, and even in the context of the stigma associated with mental illness, particularly the stigma associated within faith communities within mental illness and of mental illness. So I think just a general mental health literacy in the sense of helping the faith community recognize that these are real issues that people suffer from, and that there are things that can be treated, and that they don't fall into some kind of spiritualized, kind of sinful area. I think education is the thing to start with. Right now, as Issam mentioned, there is no licensure or quality control for people who are psychologists in Libya. There, in essence, are no psychologists in Libya, and there's only a handful of psychiatrists. So I think it's desperately important that we help establish training for them. I think that can be done two ways. One can be done as we're trying to do it, and that is take those that are in the country now that do see themselves as mental health professionals and begin to give them intensive training so they can work now. But I think in a long-term process, it would be more education, helping the universities, helping the medical schools establish appropriate curriculum and begin training kind of the next generation of mental health care providers.
Sam, do you want to add to that? And maybe it would be, I would be interested for you to talk a little bit about the stigma you mentioned around mental health in Libya, as is in many countries as well.
Well, it's the issue of stigma. I think I mean, it's not a strange issue to anybody that has been close or that has lived in a society, and any human society. Every human society has something. They tend to deal with such issues with fear, with trying to avoid, trying to ignore, pretend that it's not there. And once they have to admit that it is there, there is an accompanying sense of shame that it is there. So in some societies and not others, it may even affect the whole family's future prospects. Okay, I mean, young ladies of that family may not have the chance to get married. I mean, they would not have equal chances to get married. Why? Because they have somebody that is psychologically, disturbed, and so that in itself. But then again, the Libyan war came on, and I wouldn't say there's always a bright side to crisis, but there are always benefits that can be extracted from crisis times. And I believe that over the past 6 or 7 months, I have noticed quite an alleviation of that strong, heavy stigma that people had. Why? Because people with their backs to the wall had to say, hey, listen to me, help me. It didn't matter to them whether they were categorized as psychologically disturbed or not. They needed the help. Plus, the prevalence of the problem itself may have encouraged people to come forward and alleviate that stigma somewhat. So I think that is one positive aspect that may have resulted from the war, if there are any positive results that may result that come out from the war. But I believe that is the thing is we need to work on it. I'm pretty sure that in the meantime it may seem that it had been alleviated or lightened. If things are not done and the society gradually will go back to its normal mode of functioning, there is always a fear of such attitudes would come back and impose themselves on the society. So there is work that has to be done, and the best work that has to be done to alleviate such a stigma or the feeling of the stigma is awareness, like many of you mentioned earlier, is awareness and awareness and awareness. That is very important, as well as providing psychosocial support and psychological services in the different levels of healthcare. That in itself, I'm sure, would lighten the heavy stigma that is attached to psychological disturbance.
Thank you.
Can I just add one thing to that? I mean, I just briefly mentioned before, but the thing is there is one system in Libya that is well established and trusted, and that is Islam. That's their faith. They are a very faithful people, and I think that a lot of times we tend to ignore that as NGO. And so in the United States, for instance, the majority of psychological counseling is actually done by clergy. Psychologically distressed individuals go to clergy before they ever go to other professionals. The same thing is true in Libya. I've seen that just with my conversations with imams. People come to them with psychological problems. And I think using that system by helping them become aware, the religious leaders become aware of these problems, helping them connect with mental health care providers and make appropriate referrals. I think that is a system that, much like what's going on here in the U.S., they call it a gatekeeper model. It doesn't work, but they call it the gatekeeper model, that these clergy will make referrals. I think that is something that we're particularly interested in and trying to do training with the religious leaders. But I think that is a system that can be very beneficial to all of these things, particularly rule of law and things like that, in the sense that it is a system that's well established, the people trust it, they're heavily connected to it, and I think it can help both the development of mental health systems, but many other also.
I have a question for you, Matthew, a direct question about the Shifa groups. How do you determine who participates in the group, and are there diagnostic measures?
Anyone can participate in the group. As I said, while in a population everyone is affected by the trauma. Not everyone is traumatized to where they're going to have long-term effects. Some people are resilient within a few days to weeks. Some are resilient longer, but then some have a prolonged effect. So anyone is welcome to come to the groups. We do have diagnostic outcome measures within each group. They fill out questionnaires at the beginning and the end of the groups. We also train the Shifa group leaders to watch for those who are not making progress or who are showing more pronounced symptoms, and then they can then refer them on to the individuals that we've actually done training with, the mental health care providers there in the community, so they can get more and more intense help. So yes, we are trying to make sure that they're effective, make sure that individuals are being assessed. We do know, for instance, in the IDP camps, I have data here. In the IDP camps, 58% of the individuals when they begin the group meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. So at this point, what we're seeing, and then that for adults, that's about what you'd expect for a civilian population that's been exposed, around 60%. So,
thank you. Our final question is for the Deputy Minister. It's more rule of law focused than trauma. Can you talk about some of the rule of law, the successes that you've had in the transition in bringing about the rule of law? Even though, as we all know, it's a very, very difficult thing to promote justice and rule of law in the immediate aftermath of a conflict. But can you share some of the successes with us that you've had to date?
اللي مش عارف السؤال يقول من بداية الثورة وين يوم 17 كنا نحقق الحكومة جيناها تونا بعد تكليفنا يعني كوكيل وزارة في الحكومة يعني السؤال ولا؟ هل تتكلم عن نجاحات بناء دور القانون في المرحلة الانتقالية؟ شاركنا بعض نجاحات بناء دور القانون في المرحلة الانتقالية. يعني بناء دور القانون سعينا في استلام السجون وعارفين صعوبة استلام السجون وعالجنا مسألة الانتهاكات. وطبعا هذا شرفنا وكنت رئيس وفد ليبي في المؤتمر العالمي لحقوق الإنسان اللي فات في جنيف والحمد لله حصلنا موافقة جميع الدول دون اعتراض مع تحمل كثير من التوصيات على عاتقنا. عندما رجعنا الحمد لله أوفينا بهذه الوعود. أنهينا مشكلة السجون مصراتة والغالب يعلم لدينا بعض الأمور البسيطة جدا العالقة لازالت. تكلمنا عن مسألة التعويضات وقرارات التعويضات ومحاكمة الزاوية الأخيرة اللي عرضت في الإعلام خير دليل على أن القضاء فعلا يعني إن شاء الله هيكون في الموعد يعني في محاكمة المجرمين هذوما اللي يجب أن يقدموا العدالة في محاكمات عادلة. قاعدين نصينوا في المحاكم طبعا باش يقدروا عارفين العالم كله أن راه في دمار كبير جدا لحق مقار المحاكم والنيابات التي وإن كانت تسمى مقار نيابات ومحاكم ولكنها لا تليق بهذا العمل الشريف المقدس من حيث حتى شكلية. لكن دمرت يعني من مدينة جدابية تحديدا إلى مساعد 90% من المحاكم والنيابات وجدناها محروقة بالكامل ومدمرة ناهيك عن المدن التي تعرضت للقصف الشديد. سعينا في إجراء الصيانات. درنا برنامج أصدرنا قرار وقبل ما نجي هنا كنت ساعي فيه وهو برنامج محو الأمية في الجهاز القضائي فيما يتعلق باللغة الإنجليزية والحاسوب. للأسف الشديد يعني شوفوا أنتوا أنا ما متكلمش إنجليزي. أنتوا عارفين الاحتفال اللي دار معمر زمانه ودرنا شعلة جميلة بكتب الإنجليزي زمانه حرمنا من اللغة الإنجليزية. فهو قاعدين نعالجه يعني على الأقل قلنا حتى القاضي الكبير يلحق يتكلم إنجليزي بلكي ويعرف يستعمل الحاسوب. مش منطقي يعني رجل قضاء لا يعرف يستعمل الحاسوب ولا يتكلم إنجليزي. فدرنا برنامج محو أمية. درنا قاعات تدريب في كل محكمة ابتدائية يعني بشكل مش استئناف 7 بأكثر توسع يعني في كل محكمة ابتدائية توجد في مدينة. درنا قاعات تدريب للتدريب على محو الأمية من مسألة الإنجليزي هذه والحاسوب. أستاذ محمد يسمي فيها استشار الخاص. طبعا القوانين اللي تصدر هذينا طبعا نحن نرى نقدموا في مقترحات. مش كل القوانين تصابون انتم المجلس هو اللي يبدع في القوانين يخترع فيه. لا نحن نقدموا في مقترحات ترى ويعتمد فيهم في بعض الأحيان يعني. ففي قوانين بداية كانت منا نحن يعني في قانون العفو سمعتوا عليه. قانون العفو الخاص نحب نوضح للعالم خاصة العالم الغير الليبيين حتى في أكثر من اجتماع هنا في الولايات المتحدة يبدو أن مختلط عليهم الأمر. توقع أن يكون العفو عن الثوار الذين قاموا بانتهاك أو ببعض الانتهاكات الفردية لحقوق الإنسان، لا، بل إن هذا العفو يشمل جرائم الحق العام، وهي الجرائم التي لا تمس حق الغير، يعني كجرائم الخمر. يعني هي مراعاة كانت فيها، عملية كانت فيها نوع من المعالجة، لأن اللي هربوا من السجن هذوما خاصة في بنغازي وفي بعض المدن يعني قاموا فعلا بدور بطولي فعلا في القتال بصراحة. يعني فبيشتغلوا عارفين العفو القاصر هو ما يشمل القضايا اللي فيه حق الغير، أي قضية تتصل بحق إنسان آخر لا يعفى عنها. وعارفين أنتم إلا إذا قدم تنازل، ومش كل القضايا تنتهي بالتنازل، هناك قضايا وإن قدم فيها تنازل يؤخذ من باب الرأفة، ولكن تنفذ عليه عقوبة فيما يتعلق بالحق العام. والله شو نقول لكم، واحد بيتذكر ولا يذكر، اشتغلنا والله نشتغلوا يعني الحقيقة، يعني نحاول ونقدموا أفضل شيء يعني في هالفترة، ولكن المتاح قليل. راه بيشتغلوا عارفين، والتحديات كبيرة. وممكن لو تتبعوا تلقوا وزارة العدل، نحن مشكلتنا بس مش متعودين كرجال قضاء نطلعوا على الإعلام واجد، وما نحبوش الإعلام واجد، فلهذا مش نطلعوش نحكوا ونقولوا درنا وفعلنا وكذا. فلهذا نحن نحاولوا ديما نثبتوا للعالم بالشيء الملموس يعني، ونثبتوا للشعب بالشيء الملموس. لكن في انجازات كبيره. محكمه جدابيا ممكن في بعض شافها في التلفزيون، جدابيا مسكينه مدينه مظلومه جدا، حتى قبل حتى القصف والكلام هذا تشوف فيها وكانها يعني قريه في منطقه نائيه، ولا معناها هي في مدخل مدينه ثانيه في ليبيا. انشانا فيها محكمه، يعني حتى اللي من جدابيا نفسهم يقولوا لما نخش في المحكمه جوا ننسوا ان احنا في جدابيا، يعني طليق فعلا بالعمل القضائي يعني. والله انا حتى يعني كنت جايب معايا، حتى توقعت ان يسالوني السؤال هذا، وجبنا معنا حتى اسطوانات مسجلين فيه انجازاتنا نحن كوزاره عدل يعني اول باول. وراه محاكمه الزاويه هذه هني المفروض نحتفلوا بها نحن الليبيين. محاكمه الزاويه حاكموا فيها اتباع النظام اللي قاموا بقمع الليبيين وقتلهم، خاصه في مدينه الزاويه تعرضت للقمع، وعارفين انتم مدينه الزاويه شو صار فيها. فلهذا يعني محاكمه هؤلاء دون حدوث اي مشاكل وبشكل طبيعي جدا، هذا بروحه يعني انجاز مفروض العالم انه يضعه في الاعتبار. ممكن بس ما خذتش حقه اعلاميا، خفنا من مساله انه يتمسك وانه ما يبوش اعلام انه كذا هيك، لكن جبنا يعني الخبر وجبنا صوره للمحاكمه وكذا. طبعا حاولنا ان نحن كما نقول عرفنا ان عارفين علاقه تكامليه بين الداخليه والعدل، لكن حاولنا ان نحن نقدموا شيء بانفسنا، بحكم ان هم يبدو ان ما زال مشوارهم طويل شويه. فيما يتعلق بعمل، طبعا نحن كنا نعاني من مساله ان رجل القضاء ووكيل النيابه، يعني رجل القضاء سواء كان وكيل نيابه او قاضي حكم، مش منطقي اننا نلزمه ان هو يعمل في ظل هذا يعني الخلل الامني الكبير. يعني مش معقوله هو يعني قاضي حتى يعني من ناحيه حتى العقل والشرع، أن لا يجوز أن يجلس القضاء، يعتبر إجراء غير سليم شرعا وقانونا أن يجلس القضاء وهو خائف. مش معقولة قاضي جالس وبيحدد مصير إنسان وبيحكم وهو خايف. فلهذا درنا فكرة، اقترحنا فكرة واعتمدها مجلس الوزراء، اللي هي قلنا جهاز إسناد للشرطة القضائية دوره فقط يحمي مقار المحاكم والنيابات والأشخاص اللي يشتغلوا فين، ملاش علاقة بالسجين، ملاش علاقة بالسجون. يعني أو قاعدين نحاولوا بقدر الإمكان نحن حتى باستقلالية عن الوزارات الأخرى نقدموا شيء لليبيا، وإن شاء الله الجاي أفضل يعني.
Thank you, Deputy Minister, and I would like to thank you all on our behalf for your incredible work to promote justice and human rights, and your work to help people heal and overcome these traumas. And I would really like to thank you and all of our Libyan colleagues for taking the time to come to the US in the midst of a time in Libya where they're really needed. So to share your experiences and to highlight trauma as an issue, we thank you sincerely, and thank